blind, and still wobbling around with a cane in the middle of the street. "Go home and live off welfare, Granny," the white cop shouted in broad daylight, then aggressively yanked the cane from the black woman's hand and smashed it until it snapped in two. He laughed as people filmed the scene. He thought he'd be praised for restoring order, but what he didn't know was this. The blind woman was the mother of a former Delta Force commander, the man who once orchestrated top-secret national missions. And this time, the thing that breaks won't just be the cane. If that were your mother, what would you do? It started with the sound of a tapping cane, soft, rhythmic, deliberate. Edna Moore, 72 years old, blind since the age of 16, was moving slowly across the white-striped pedestrian crosswalk in front of Waverly and Fifth, the noon sign casting long shadows from street signs and awnings onto the asphalt. She didn't speak. She didn't rush. The world moved around her, but she remained centered in her task to cross safely. Then a patrol car jerked to a stop beside her, its tires screeching inches from her shins. The door slammed open before the engine had time to quiet. Officer Travis Lasker, white male, 39, buzz cut, mirrored Oakley's and a jaw so tight it looked like it had been clenched since birth, stepped out and barked, "The fuck are you doing, lady? This ain't your lane." A beat passed. Edna didn't turn her head. She couldn't. Her hand trembled slightly on the cane's grip. Then she said calmly, "Sir, I'm just trying to get across." Lasker stepped closer, waving his hand exaggeratedly in front of her face. "Are you blind? What? You get a pass now 'cause you got yourself a stick and a disability card." His voice had volume, but what chilled more was the tone. Theatrical cruelty designed for an audience, and there was one. A small crowd had already started gathering on the sidewalk. Phones came out, heads turned. No one spoke. Lasker crouched slightly, leaning in toward Edna's ear like he was telling a secret. "Black and blind? You doubled down on needing attention, huh?" She said nothing. Her hand tightened just once on the cane. Lasker's eyes locked onto it. Without warning, he ripped the cane from her hand. Gasps erupted around them. One phone slipped from a woman's grip. The cane hung for a split second in the air, a slim white rod, old but clean, with a looped strap worn thin from years of use. Then, with a motion that was as quick as it was deliberate, he bent it across his thigh. It snapped with a hollow crack that echoed against the buildings like dry wood breaking in winter. Edna took half a step backward, off balance. Her arms floated midair, searching for something that was no longer there. She didn't fall, but she stood frozen. Her orientation, her axis, her confidence shattered like the fiberglass in Lasker's hand. He didn't stop. He flung the broken halves onto the street like garbage, then took 2 strides forward and kicked them hard. The longer half skittered across the lane and hit the foot of a little black girl, no older than 6, who stood wide-eyed beside her mother. "Move it, sweetheart," he shouted toward the girl, as if it were somehow her fault the object had reached her. Her mother yanked her back without a word. A college student in a gray hoodie stepped forward, phone still recording in his hand. "Yo, you can't do that. She's blind, man. What the hell is wrong with you?" Travis turned like a snake, recoiling, stormed up to the student, grabbed his collar with one hand, and slammed his chest against the hood of his cruiser. The phone clattered to the pavement. "You want to see what being blind feels like, kid?" he hissed, pushing down harder. The student grunted. Someone shouted, "Hey, get your hands off him!" But no one moved closer. Behind the patrol car, a traffic light turned green, but the cars didn't move. A silent standoff had replaced the usual honking. Lasker stood upright again, brushed his uniform smooth, and turned to Edna. "Next time, try walking with a leash, not a fucking attitude." Then he looked up, scanned the crowd, and smiled like he had just won a bet. No one clapped, no one spoke. Not a single voice challenged him. To the left, standing by a lamp post, an old white man in a weathered Braves cap shook his head slowly. He leaned toward the woman next to him and said in a hoarse whisper, "Don't get involved. These things happen all the time." His tone wasn't heartless. It was defeated, like someone who'd lived long enough to watch wrong become routine. Across the street, a teenager in a delivery uniform took a photo, then pocketed his phone, not to share, but as evidence. Two tourists whispered in French and walked away, while a city bus pulled to the curb, paused, then kept moving without opening its doors. No one opened the bus window. No one looked at the woman still standing alone in the crosswalk. Edna didn't speak. She didn't cry. She didn't bend down to find the cane pieces. Her right hand remained hovering in the air, inches above where the handle used to be. Her left hand was curled against her chest, as if holding herself still. Around her, life resumed. Pedestrians crossed. Taxis beeped. Pigeons flapped and scattered across the sunlit concrete, but no one reached for her, not even to ask if she needed help. Lasker returned to his cruiser like a man who had delivered justice. He didn't glance back. He didn't care. He pulled the radio to his mouth and said, "Resolved." Civilians dispersed. Then he closed the door and idled there, engine humming, eyes behind his shades, scanning the sidewalk for another reason to flex authority. By the time Edna finally moved, it had been just over 3 minutes. But the cameras had already captured everything, every line, every stomp, every word, and the sound of the cane snapping would be the kind of audio that would haunt people long after the video looped on their timelines. But for now, there were no hashtags, no outrage, just a woman who had learned once again that there were ways to be struck that left no bruises, only silence. And sometimes, silence was the loudest kind of violence there was. She didn't move at first. Edna stood where the cane had been, her right hand still suspended in the air, as if the grip might return by will alone. Around her the world inhaled, but no one exhaled. The pieces of the cane lay sprawled, one near the gutter, the other past the crosswalk where a child had been pulled away. A gust of wind sent a plastic bag tumbling across the sidewalk, but no one bent to catch it. A mother passed close, clutching her daughter's hand tightly. The girl turned to look, her wide brown eyes fixed on Edna's empty palm. The mother yanked her arm and snapped, "Don't look at that! It's not our business!" She pulled the girl along without missing a step, shielding her face with one hand, as if the act of blindness might be contagious. The silence thickened. Phones were still out. Screens still glowed, but no one stepped forward. A woman in scrubs hovered 2 feet away, visibly hesitating, until a man in a dark security uniform strode past her and spoke curtly into his shoulder-mount mic. "Disruption near the south exit. Elderly female, possibly unstable." He didn't stop, didn't address Edna, just passed by with that mechanical gait of someone trained not to see, only to report. Across the street on the second floor of a cafe, someone had started a live stream. The title read, "Blind Lady Goes Off on Cop. LOL." There were over 2,000 viewers already, most of them laughing emojis or "WTF is happening" comments. One said, "Bet she ain't even blind, they pull this shit all the time." Another chimed in, "That cop's got patience, I would have done worse." The comments scrolled faster than the clip buffed. Nobody asked if she was okay. Edna dropped to her knees, not dramatically, not as a collapse, just as a necessity. Her balance was gone, her bearings stripped. She placed her palms gently on the asphalt, sweeping them side to side, searching for fragments of what had been hers for decades. A sound escaped her throat, not a sob, not a plea, just a low breath that cracked in the middle like the cane had done. Her fingers touched something rough, a jagged end. She tried to grasp it, but it slid out from under her touch as a delivery truck thundered by, sending a gust that stung her eyes. The crowd grew, not because of compassion, but because people love aftermaths. A young couple leaned against a parking meter, sipping iced coffees. The man murmured, "She should have stayed on the sidewalk." The woman shrugged. She was probably being difficult on purpose. That's how they get reactions. Behind them, a teenage boy raised his phone, whispered, "Zoom in, this part's going viral," and held steady as Edna's knees scraped against the concrete. A nurse, older, white, her badge turned backward, took one cautious step toward the street. She made eye contact with Edna, who couldn't see her but still tilted her head slightly toward the sound. That single gesture, that subtle acknowledgement of presence, was enough to make the nurse move. She stepped off the curb. "Ma'am," she called gently, "let me help you." But before she reached her, a second security guard, younger, taller, with a clipped radio and mirrored glasses, stepped directly into her path. "Back up," he said firmly. "Lawsuit liability. You touch her, you're involved." "She's blind," the nurse whispered. "She needs—" "Back up," he repeated, his voice flat, non-negotiable. "Unless you want your name on an incident report?" The nurse froze, her face flushed. She didn't argue, just turned and walked away. The radio on the guard's shoulder crackled to life. "Status check, south exit," he answered. "Still non-compliant. Bystanders dispersing." But no one was dispersing. They were watching. Phones still hovered in midair. Faces peeked from behind the bus shelter glass. A man inside the sandwich shop across the street pressed his forehead to the window, chewing slowly, not blinking. Another recorded through the glass, but kept the audio muted so his coworkers wouldn't hear. The voyeurism was silent, but it was there, thick, parasitic. Edna finally found the longest piece. Her fingers closed around the broken shaft, the edges frayed and sharp. She lifted it to her lap. It wasn't usable, but she clung to it the way someone might cling to a steering wheel after a crash, not for function, but for orientation. Behind her, the city churned on. Laughter from a passing bicycle gang. Music is leaking from a car window. Sirens, but far away and uninterested. The sun was now fully overhead. The concrete radiated heat. Edna's shoulders curled slightly forward. She shifted weight from one knee to the other, the grit grinding beneath her like glass. No one knelt beside her. No one even offered an umbrella. From the far end of the sidewalk, a woman in business heels muttered to a colleague. She probably caused it herself. That's how they play it. Beta reaction, then sue. The colleague nodded, not looking up from his phone. I mean, if she's so helpless, where's her family? Two teenagers burst out of a sneaker shop behind them and stopped short when they saw the scene. One laughed. "Damn, she's still down there?" The other raised his camera, framing the shot. Caption this: "Don't cross if you can't stand the heat." They doubled over at their joke. Edna didn't move. Her hands rested on her lap now, palms open. Her head was slightly bowed, not in shame, but in stillness. Her ears tracked every step, every click of a tongue, every exhale of disgust dressed as indifference. She didn't beg. She didn't curse. She simply waited for someone to do something, for anyone to remember she was a person. But what she received instead was the full weight of a city that had learned how to ignore cruelty dressed in uniform. A society that mistook compliance for peace, that looked at a woman on her knees and asked, not how to help, but how to move past without being bothered. Eventually, a dispatcher's voice came through the cruiser's speaker. "Unit 12, are you clear from the previous call?" Lasker answered casually. "Affirmative. Situation resolved. Returning to the route." He never stepped out again. He drove off. No apology. No glance back. The engine swallowed the street's final gasp of conscience. When the patrol car disappeared down the avenue, a man in a pinstriped shirt clapped twice, slow and sarcastic. "Well done, America," he muttered, and walked away. Edna rose to her feet without help, not quickly, not smoothly. She used the broken piece like a splint against gravity. She didn't turn toward the crowd. She didn't acknowledge the cameras. She didn't thank or blame. She simply stood, and still no one came to walk her home. The clip didn't go viral right away. It didn't explode on social media or get intercepted by reporters or legal watchdogs or civil rights agencies. It slid through the cracks in silence, starting with a single tap in a precinct group chat called BAR, short for Boys Above Rules. The name wasn't ironic. It was a rite of passage, a channel reserved for patrol officers, administrative cronies, and off-the-cock supervisors who found satisfaction not in justice, but in inside jokes, unsupervised memes, and the unfiltered theater of power. Officer Ryan Deeks, fresh from his third month of field duty, filmed the entire incident from the passenger seat of Unit 22, chin tilted up, one hand resting near the radio, but never reaching for it. He didn't warn Lasker. He didn't check on the woman after the cane cracked. He didn't stop recording when the old lady dropped to her knees. He just held his phone vertically, steady, deadpan, and posted the footage to BAR with a 6-word caption. Lasker back on it again, LOL. The responses came fast. That stick Snapdot gave her the full welcome package. "Bro, She folded like laundry. One message stood out, a reply that would later surface in hearings, investigations, and 100 op-eds that tried to explain what kind of culture brewed beneath the patch and pistol. Gotta love when the sticks break. That sound is better than radio static. 3 clapping hand emojis followed, each one typed separately, like punctuation marks on a body. Normally, the thread would have stayed buried inside the precinct firewall. But Deeks wasn't careful. In a rush, or maybe out of laziness, he added the wrong group to the message. Another thread, one built for interagency coordination between field officers and public policy liaisons. It wasn't as tightly watched as it should have been, but it reached someone it was never meant to, and the man who received it didn't double tap. He didn't reply with an emoji. He didn't even finish his sip of water before locking his eyes on the clip and going still. He had no name in that chat, no photo, just a black circle for a profile and a single dot for status. Green, active, watching. The meeting was mid-sentence when it happened. Government building, Washington, D.C., 3rd floor, conference room 6. A laminated schedule on the wall read, Accessibility Reform Frameworks, Public Infrastructure Equity by 2030. Bottles of sparkling water lined the table. A spread of untouched bagels gleamed in overhead fluorescent light. The presenters were still halfway through a bullet point slide about public restroom dimensions when the man in the gray suit at the far end of the table clicked play. The volume wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be. The sound of the cane snapping silenced the room like a firecracker under a stained glass dome. The woman on the screen fell to her knee. The officer didn't flinch. A child shrieked, off camera. Somewhere a hand reached toward her. Somewhere another hand stopped it. When the footage ended, no one spoke. The man closed the window, wiped the screen, and tapped once on the desk. His assistant leaned in. "Sir?" He didn't look at her. "Where's the back angle?" She blinked. "Sorry? There's another phone. Behind him." Watched the shadow as the girl screams. Someone else was recording. She nodded too fast, typed nothing, and backed away. The man stood, smoothed the front of his jacket, and left the room without taking his tablet or his name card. Elsewhere, inside the precinct, no one knew the leak had occurred. The bar group continued, flooded with gifs and laughing tags. Someone posted a cartoon of a blindfolded person walking into traffic. Another tagged the post, "Edna got 'em shaken." A sergeant liked it with a thumbs-up emoji. A badge number was attached. No one cared. No one wondered how far it had spread. No one stopped to question if one of the message recipients wasn't a cop at all. The email reached the ethics channel of a federal internal monitoring board by way of an encrypted link from an anonymous IP. The subject line read, "This isn't just a bad cop." Attached was one frame. The cane mid-air, Edna's hand still extended, the officer's face turned half away, like it didn't matter what came next. The reactions in the office were mixed. Some didn't believe it was real. Others thought it was doctored. But one woman, an older analyst with glaucoma and a cane of her own, printed the image and pinned it to her cubicle wall. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. The moment had already traveled. Within 2 hours, the clip landed in the direct inbox of a strategist listed on no public rolls, a consultant who never gave interviews, never published papers, and never attached his name to the policies he wrote behind closed doors. But when his name surfaced, men in uniform sat straighter, and elected officials canceled flights. The man watched the video alone in his office. No sound. He didn't need it. His eyes moved frame by frame, not on the victim, but on the officer. His posture, his pacing, the confidence of someone who had done this before. He froze the clip at the moment just before the cane broke, enlarged the shadow of a hand holding another phone. He tapped the screen. "Find that angle," he said. His assistant nodded, already dialing. "Do you want full precinct records?" "No." He stood. "Not yet." "Should we alert oversight?" "No." "Then what?" He walked to the window, stared at the skyline like it owed him something. "We wait." Back in the precinct chat, no one mentioned the accidental forward. No one knew the group had been compromised, but one user who never spoke finally typed a single line. "Still think no one's watching?" It was met with silence. Then a reply, "They always watch." They never act. Another reply, this time with a video snippet, just the sound of the cane snapping, looped once, attached with a label. Favorite sound of the week. Someone laughed. Someone liked it. Someone sent a sticker of a dog holding a baton, but the person who typed the warning had already logged off. In Washington, a private line lit up on the desk of a high-ranking policy officer. The file arrived via secure drop, tagged Incident, Waverly and 5th, Civilian, Edna Moore. Status, escalating. Underneath, a private note was attached by the strategist himself. No salutation, no signature, just a phrase, this one isn't going away. And then, a single question typed below, are we still pretending there's no pattern? It would be hours before anyone realized how much it already shifted. Hours before the emoji reaction, a sarcastic triple clap, surfaced on message boards, triggering public outrage. Hours before the phrase better than radio static became a hashtag, used in both anger and shame. But by then, the man in the gray suit had already printed the still frame, circled the moment the cane snapped, and underlined a single detail, the grin on the officer's face. He stared at it for a long time before closing the folder and locking it away, not because he wanted to forget, but because forgetting had never been the plan. Observation was not silent, and this time, watching would not be enough. He closed the folder with the same precision he used to sign peace terms, budget freezes, and termination orders. Not with sentiment, but with clarity. No one saw the man leave the office that afternoon. There were no security swipes, no corridor chatter, no last-minute calls to his driver. He simply vanished between the fluorescent hum of a forgotten federal hallway and the silence of a name that did not need announcement. By the time the sun dipped past the 7th floor of the building, his digital presence had already folded into itself. No calendar entries, no press briefings, not a single message traceable to any known agency portal. His existence, like his work, lived just outside documentation. Search his name online and you'd find nothing. No headshots, no conferences, no digital residue, no signature LinkedIn arrogance. Malcolm E. Moore did not exist on Google, not in the way others did. He wasn't hidden, he was omitted by design, and that absence was louder than any resume. But within the rooms that mattered, the war tables, the legislative bunkers, the lockdown advisory boards, his presence was felt like gravity. He didn't carry authority in tone, he carried it in the pauses between questions, in the way others deferred without being asked, in the shape of a sentence no one else could finish. His name was never spoken first, it was always echoed, quietly, by those who feared being asked. You don't know Malcolm? There had been a memo once circulated in 2019 under restricted clearance, stamped in red, reviewed by 2 federal judges, and marked "Do not forward under any circumstances." The line most remembered was buried halfway through page 3. Malcolm E. Moore, clearance not to be defined. Position exempt from hierarchy. Consult only upon direct request or national disruption. No one had ever seen a note like it. No title, no rank, just a mandate. If he calls, answer. If he asked, comply. If he moved, get out of the way. No photo accompanied the memo. At one point, a junior executive at Homeland Security attempted to schedule an introductory lunch routine. Harmless, a handshake and a 5-slide briefing. The request came back shredded, literally, and stapled to the scraps was a post-it, handwritten in the clearest black ink. Your protocols don't reach this far. Later that same year, during a NATO coordination summit in Brussels, the Secretary of Transportation extended his hand across a reception hall, smiling as he said, "It's an honor to finally meet you, sir." The room went still. Malcolm didn't raise his eyes. He stood motionless, then turned his shoulders slightly and walked past the outstretched arm without a word. The secretary's smile curdled on contact. A week later, Malcolm submitted a sealed report detailing the secretary's previous opposition to key disability transit reforms, legislation buried in committee under a technicality called non-urgent classification. Malcolm didn't need revenge. He had documentation and time and the absolute certainty that systems rot in silence if no one names the smell. There were no biographies, but there were stories. Stories that hovered in the air around press rooms and policy retreats like cigarette smoke from a past you didn't want to admit still lingered. In one such account, a senior advisor for the White House swore that Malcolm's handwritten amendments to an executive order had stopped a planned operation in northern Africa before it started, not because of human rights, not because of public perception, but because he had circled a paragraph and written in the margin, "Short-term gain, long-term collapse." That single phrase, written in a style no one else used, sent ripples that canceled 4 flights, delayed 2 appointments, and made 5 men in polished suits call their lawyers. He once sat in on a closed-door meeting with corporate liaisons during a pharmaceutical pricing negotiation. No one knew he would attend. He didn't sit at the table. He sat at the back, by the door, without a nameplate or notepad. When the executives left, he stayed. The ones who tried to talk to him afterward were told, gently but firmly, he doesn't engage at that level. So there's an old podcast, buried in the archives of a DC think tank, only available through an internal academic server, where a retired intelligence official was asked, half in jest, "So, who was the most powerful unelected person you ever met?" The man laughed, hesitated, and said, "I never met him. I just saw the aftermath of his notes." The host pressed, "What do you mean?" The guest replied, "I saw his signature once. It was at the bottom of a memo that stopped a joint operation less than 24 hours before go time. No phone call, no announcement, just a black line through a directive, and his name under it. Everyone in the room folded." That's when I knew I didn't want to meet him. I don't want to owe a ghost. A former president mentioned him once, barely, in the footnotes of a memoir, buried deep in Chapter 21, under a reflection on domestic policy failures. The sentence read, "There are some people who speak only when every other room has gone quiet. Malcolm Moore was one of those people. When I heard his voice, I listened, because it meant something had already gone wrong." Later in the same chapter, the same president described a meeting during a global financial crisis. He wrote, "Advisors were shouting over each other, numbers flying across the table, panic riding the edges of everyone's posture. Malcolm sat in silence. Then he looked at the room and said, 'You've built a machine that eats the slowest first. Eventually, it will eat your credibility too.'" The room went silent. No one argued, and the room never went back to shouting again. No official record shows what Malcolm was doing in the years following that remark, but everyone who had ever been near the machinery of statecraft knew the truth. If Malcolm Moore had seen something, something was about to change. Not loudly, not quickly, but thoroughly, and without fanfare. He wasn't the storm. He was the shift in barometric pressure before the storm, the moment before the microphone picked up the feedback, which was why when the video of a blind woman's cane being snapped across a patrol officer's thigh landed in his inbox, unmarked, unrequested, uncaptioned, he didn't need anyone to explain it. He didn't need to be told it was his mother. He didn't even react as a son. He reacted as the one person everyone hoped would never open that file, because when he did, the rules changed. Not from protest, not from the press, but from the inevitable precision of someone who knew how to make institutions flinch without ever raising his voice. At the time the footage reached him, he hadn't spoken to his mother in 3 weeks. Not out of distance, but out of discipline. There were boundaries between the man and the memory, and he had kept them intact with surgical rigor until that cane cracked. And in that sound, in that sharp, hollow, unassuming snap, something in him took inventory, not of rage, not of revenge, but of weight, of what it meant that someone had laid hands on the one person he never had to protect until now. When his assistant returned with a printed summary of precinct data, he didn't read it. He already knew. He just held it in his hand for a moment, then said, "They think there are no eyes in the room." She didn't respond. He placed the paper in a drawer, closed it quietly, and added, as if to no one in particular, "Let them keep thinking that." He didn't tell anyone he was leaving. He didn't alert his team or notify the agency that never truly managed him. He didn't arrange security or a driver, or a press blackout. He simply took the long way down the stairs, turned his phone to silent, and vanished from the circuits that normally pulsed at his fingertips. There were no coded instructions, no traced steps, only one direction, home. Not to rest, not to reconnect, but to see what they had touched. The cab that brought him from the airport didn't know who he was. The driver didn't ask. Malcolm wore no tie, no badge, no watch, just a charcoal overcoat and shoes that made no sound when they hit the pavement. The sky was low and overcast, not the kind of dramatic storm he'd imagined, but something quieter, heavier, a mood made of cement. When the car turned off the highway and onto narrow roads flanked by narrow homes, the engine seemed to grow more cautious. Trees leaned in from both sides, branches like arms stretched over him, not in welcome, but in memory. They passed the convenience store with the flickering OPN sign that had never quite fixed itself, the barber shop that only served cash, the church that used to be a liquor store, and then, after a final left, the house came into view, still painted the same color she'd chosen in '92, still flanked by the same rusted mailbox with the nameplate no one replaced after it peeled off. The siding was cracked, the roof sagged near the back, but the porch light worked. Of course it did. She never let the porch light fail. He stepped out, didn't rush, didn't look back at the car, which pulled away without a word. Gravel crunched underfoot. The wind shifted, curtains moved. Behind a window across the street, a pair of eyes squinted through blinds. Another followed from the second floor of a duplex. A voice, low and hoarse, murmured to someone just out of sight, "He's back." After all this time, he came back. A child's voice responded, "Is he going to be on the news?" The reply was silence. He climbed the porch steps one by one, ran a gloved hand across the rail his mother used when her knees started failing, then reached the front door. He didn't knock like a visitor. He placed his knuckles flat against the wood and pressed twice. Not loud, not hesitant, just enough. The door creaked open. No chain, no voice, just the warm weight of familiarity. He stepped inside and closed it behind him. The air smelled of lemon oil and old books. The carpet hadn't changed. The walls still held the same chipped molding, repaired once by hand when contractors wanted too much. He stood in the foyer for a moment, then he turned to the right and entered the room that had been hers since the neighborhood stopped pretending she would ever leave. Nothing had been disturbed. The curtains were drawn, letting in a filtered gray glow that softened every corner. Her chair was empty. Her cane was not. It lay across the armrest, but not the new one. Not the broken plastic she'd been left with on the street. This was the first one, the one from decades ago. Fiberglass, dulled from use but straight. He picked it up, ran his fingers along the spine until he found the scar. A notch, barely visible near the bottom, the place where the baton of a uniformed man had struck in 1983. When she'd demanded to open a Braille literacy class in a building the city claimed lacked funding for non-essentials. She'd kept the cane ever since, not as a crutch, as a ledge. He returned it to the armrest gently, then turned toward the hallway. His steps made no sound. His eyes paused on every door frame, every chipped doorknob, every coat hook. Then he reached the back of the house where the door to the porch sat slightly ajar. Muddy footprints led inward. Dried, smeared, careless. Someone had tracked them in, probably a patrol boot, probably uninvited, probably unwelcome. He didn't speak. He knelt, took a rag from under the sink, the same drawer she always kept it in, and began wiping them clean. Not hurried, not angry, with the calm thoroughness of someone who had cleaned worse things. With each pass, the mud disappeared. With each movement, something else hardened behind his ribs. When he finished, he stood and reached for the doorframe. A slip of paper was tucked between two old recipe books. It was folded carefully, yellowed at the edges. He pulled it free. Written in pencil, smudged by time, the words were still legible. "Miss Edna, you showed me light without needing a lamp. Love, Jerome." No last name, no date, but he remembered the boy. The way he'd stood trembling in the hallway of the school that refused to let him in without a parent, the way his voice cracked when she said, "You can read with your fingers, but you think with your heart." That boy had graduated, had become something, And still, here, this was what he'd left behind. Malcolm folded the note and placed it back where it belonged, not as memorabilia, as evidence. He made his way to the front again, where the lock on the storm door had come loose. He didn't call a repairman. He took a screwdriver from the drawer beside the fridge and fixed it, realigned the screws, checked the hinge, tested the latch, then cleaned the outside glass with a cloth she kept folded beside the flower. There was no conversation, no noise, just the slow rhythm of a man restoring the perimeter of something sacred. Outside, neighbors who hadn't spoken to Edna in years now stood behind fences, half concealed by hedges. One man in a lawn chair whispered, "That's her boy, the one who went high up." A woman replied, "Heard he works for the White House." Another added, "Nah, higher." No one dared walk over. No one waved. They just watched, because the return of someone like Malcolm wasn't a reunion. It was an omen. He finished the repairs just before dusk, then returned inside, locked the door, and sat in the armchair across from hers. He didn't take his coat off. He didn't open his laptop. He didn't speak into a phone or read a file. He just sat, across from an empty chair, in a house that hadn't asked for the world to come knocking, but knew it would. In that silence, he remembered something she'd once told him when he was 16 and ready to leave. She'd said, "There are two kinds of people who change the world. Those who break things loud enough to be heard, and those who fix them quiet enough to never be thanked. I raised you to choose the second one." He hadn't replied then. He didn't need to. And now, decades later, here he was, not to mourn, not to rage, but to fix something so broken that even a quiet man had to act. He leaned forward, picked up her cane, and placed it beside the front door. He didn't touch the new one. That one didn't deserve to be remembered. He placed the cane beside the door and stood there for a moment, watching the last of the light die through the small square of glass. The silence inside the house was complete. Not the kind of silence born from absence, but the kind carved by deliberation, shaped like a choice that had been postponed long enough. He didn't sigh, didn't clench his fists. Malcolm E. Moore didn't express. He executed. His eyes fell to the small leather-bound notebook that had traveled with him across 4 administrations, 3 continents, and more classified briefings than most senators could imagine. He never locked it. He didn't need to. Its safety didn't come from secrecy. It came from the fact that no one who read it ever misunderstood what it meant. He opened it slowly, fingers steady, and on a blank page near the middle he wrote with the same pen he always used, a matte black Mont Blanc that never left his jacket. He didn't date it, just words centered on the page, written in even, angular lines. A broken cane isn't frightening, but the men who think it means nothing, those are the ones who should be. He paused for exactly 3 seconds, closed the book, slid it into the inside pocket of his coat, and moved to the desk by the window. The desk was old, but it worked. The hinges didn't squeak, the drawers didn't stick. It was where she paid her bills, wrote her letters, and tracked the things no one else bothered to. And tonight, it would be where he opened the first file. Not on a computer, not through a network. On paper, pulled from an envelope stamped with no return address, sealed by hand and delivered by someone who owed him nothing but respect. The file contained 2 names. Not high-ranking, not famous, but important. Both had filed complaints against Officer Travis Lasker in previous years. Both had been ignored. Both had, at some point, disappeared from the system. He didn't need to know why. He only needed to know where. He wrote their addresses down, one in Queens, the other in Oakland, and beneath each one, he wrote a single line. Don't ask them to speak, just listen once. He folded the paper, placed it inside a new envelope, and addressed it by hand. He would not send a team. He would not request a statement. He would appear, alone, like he always did when it mattered. There had already been inquiries. Calls from networks. CNN had left 3 messages in the last 48 hours. CBS was offering exclusivity. The Times had emailed his assistant with the line, "We know you're in play. When you're ready to move, we'll be." He'd declined all of them with the same message. Every time. Not yet. Not you. But when a small podcast from the Blind Justice Alliance requested an interview, not because they knew who he was, but because they'd read a quote his mother once gave in 1997, He responded within the hour. The host expected a team, a schedule, maybe a lawyer on the line. Instead, Malcolm appeared 5 minutes early. No video, just voice. He didn't identify himself as her son. He didn't correct the host when she mispronounced his last name. He just waited for the right moment. And then he said, calmly, as if reading a memo, "There are moments that make noise, and moments that make changes. I'm not here for the first kind." That was all. 15 minutes. No raised voice, no headline sound bites. Just a sentence that would be replayed in classrooms a year later by people who still didn't know who he was. After the call ended, he made exactly one more call. To a law office that hadn't heard from him since 2004. The receptionist stammered when she heard his voice. She put him through immediately. The attorney's voice was hesitant, warm, too warm. "It's been a long time, Mr. Moore. I've thought of you often." Malcolm didn't reply to the false comfort. He said simply, "You're the one who declined my mother's case?" A pause, a breath. "Yes," the attorney said, slower now. "At the time, I didn't think we could win." "At the time?" Malcolm said. "You said she was too unknown to risk precedent on." "Things were different then," the attorney offered. "Are they different now?" Malcolm asked. Silence. Then, "They should be." Malcolm nodded, even though the man couldn't see it. "Then, let's see if your firm still believes in losing for the right reason." He didn't wait for agreement. He just ended the call and placed the phone back on the desk. He never needed permission, only readiness. That night, he didn't sleep. He didn't pace. He sat by the kitchen window, watching the street as it faded from light to shadow. Somewhere across town, a squad room was pretending nothing had happened. A press officer was preparing a statement full of passive voice and empty empathy, but the ground had already shifted, because Malcolm wasn't building a case. He was building conditions. Systems buckle when variables change, and he was a variable no one knew how to calculate. He drafted 6 letters, not legal filings, not political demands, letters, precise, directed, each one to a specific official who had at some point dismissed concerns about excessive force against disabled citizens. He didn't quote statutes, he quoted their own words back to them. Each line dated, sourced, and bracketed. At the bottom of each letter, a line written in ink, centered perfectly. "Would you like to revise your position before the nation sees it?" He signed none of them. He didn't need to. In the morning, he received a summary report from a private monitoring firm he'd worked with during his last advisory contract. It showed spike patterns in social media sentiment, text analysis of thousands of anonymous posts about the Kane incident, and one particularly telling graph. Mentions of Edna had increased by 4,700%. The report ended with a question. "Do we escalate this?" He didn't answer. He deleted the message. It was already escalated. He wasn't managing a moment. He was reconfiguring the consequence. And still, he hadn't said her name out loud. Not once. Not in the call. Not in the interview. Not in the letters. Because the weight of her name wasn't for cameras. It was a fault line, and when spoken, it wouldn't just crack glass, it would sink foundations. By noon, the porch outside was quiet again. No reporters, no neighbors, just the wind brushing gently against the boards he'd fixed the night before. He stepped outside briefly, felt the chill gather beneath his collar, and closed the door again behind him. Inside, the cane remained untouched by the entry, and beside it, on a small wooden table, his notebook lay open again. Another line had been added. There are no warning shots when justice remembers how to aim. He closed the cover. The line he wrote stayed on the page, ink still drying, as the screen across the room began to flicker with heat maps of movement. Not just physical movement, digital velocity. Public attention travels not in steps, but in waves. It started small, like most things do, with a captioned clip stripped of context and reposted by a disability rights page that had fewer than 500 followers. The video wasn't flashy. It didn't feature violence set to music or rage-heavy narration. It showed exactly 12 seconds of footage. A white baton in a blind woman's hand being pulled, bent, and snapped in half. No shouting, no blood, just that sickening, hollow crack that didn't sound like fiberglass, it sounded like bone. The audio wasn't amplified, the volume wasn't boosted, but the sound traveled, and in less than 24 hours it was everywhere. The clip passed hands like fire in a dry field. First among activists, then educators, then musicians, then comedians who didn't even dare to joke, just posted the video with a black screen and a caption that read, "This is what silence sounds like." Then came the tweets. Hundreds, then thousands. One in particular stood out. No image, no profanity, no plea. Just 7 words in stark white text over a black square. The cane was in her eye. You broke both mon say. That sentence became the war cry. It became a hashtag. It became the name of the wave that followed. Within 36 hours, the cane was her eyes trended across every major platform, not just in English, but in Spanish, French, Portuguese, and Korean. Blind communities in Sao Paulo held vigils. A school in Berlin translated the phrase into Braille and mounted it across their entrance like a banner. No celebrities led the charge, no brands claimed it. It moved without marketing, without force. It was pure momentum. A news anchor in Chicago read the words aloud, then paused on air, looked directly into the camera, and said, "For the first time, I don't have a follow-up question." That moment alone was replayed 5 million times in 3 days. Malcolm didn't share the clip. He didn't comment on the hashtag. But he knew it was exactly what he had set in motion, without fingerprints. Because the game wasn't to control the wave. It was to ensure it didn't die in silence. He had seen moments like this fizzle before. A protest here, a headline there, then gone. But this time, there was design. Someone had turned the raw sound of that cane snapping into a metronome, and the world was marching to it now. At exactly 8:42 p.m. on the 3rd night, a new post went up from an anonymous account on SoundCloud. No profile picture, no tags, no credit, just a haunting, looping piece of music built around one sound, the cane snapping. It was slowed down, stretched, and layered with soft piano beneath it. At first, the rhythm felt accidental, then deliberate, then unshakable. The track was only 2 minutes and 27 seconds long, but by dawn it had already been used in over 400 reels, 2,000 stories, and nearly 10,000 video edits, most featuring no faces, only words, no violence, only resonance. A television station in New Orleans used the track to score a short tribute to historical figures with disabilities who'd been arrested, silenced, or overlooked. At the end, they showed only the cane, fractured at the center, spinning slowly in the air before freezing mid-mation. White text appeared, "You heard it break, now listen to what follows." Across the country, classrooms began projecting the footage in silence. Teachers didn't explain it, they just pressed play, let the students watch, and then left the room, quiet for 60 full seconds afterward. It wasn't a lesson plan, it was a reckoning. Some tried to control the narrative, predictably. A sheriff from an adjacent jurisdiction posted, "Officers deserve due process." Let's remember we only see a few seconds of video. He was ratioed into silence. A retired political commentator asked, was she even fully compliant? That clip was reposted with no comment, only the sound of the cane snapping, followed by the words, "This is what you defended." Even the people who typically stirred counter-movements, the talk show contrarians, the contrived centrists, said nothing, because there was nothing safe to say. Then came the art. A boy, 7 years old, legally blind, named Elijah, drew what he couldn't see. With textured markers and hand guidance from his sister, he sketched what he felt in the audio. A woman is standing, a cane breaking, a crowd is turning away. His caption, dictated by voice software, read, "She sounded like my teacher." His mother posted the drawing. The image spread like wildfire. Within 48 hours, it was printed onto banners, painted onto the side of a community center in Atlanta, and flashed across Times Square during an ad slot donated by an anonymous sponsor. A news magazine ran a feature, not on the boy, in the image. "The blind see better than we do," the headline read. Beneath it, the subheading, a drawing that reshaped public empathy traced by a hand that has never seen light. That issue sold out in 2 days, not because it was sensational, because it was true. Still, no one knew Malcolm was behind it. He hadn't posted, hadn't tweeted, hadn't spoken again. His name wasn't trending. His silence wasn't absence. It was orchestration. A major newspaper tried to find him. They traced the podcast audio, tried to match his voice, called in analysts, even ran a piece that said, "Who is the man behind the movement?" The next day, someone graffitied over the headline on a newsstand and replaced it with, "Who cares who leads when the world finally listens?" Inside the system, things trembled. Departments whispered, officers closed their social media accounts. A media advisor from the mayor's office sent a private memo warning, "Do not comment, do not repost, do not mention the cane. Anything you say will become the story." Another attached a mock Q&A for public officials. The first question read, "Do you support the officer's conduct?" The suggested answer was blank. Meanwhile, the clip itself was picked up by independent filmmakers. One layered it against archival footage of protest marches from the 1960s, cutting between silence and snap, until the rhythm of that breaking point was unmistakable. The short film won a festival award before it even aired. Its final frame held one line. "It was never about how loud you shouted. It was always about how quiet they hoped you'd stay." A journalist posted a headline that became a symbol. "The cane was broken, justice is sharpening." It wasn't just a metaphor, it was a signal. That phrase was repainted across street murals, carved into protest signs, embroidered onto jackets. It wasn't about Malcolm. It wasn't even about Edna anymore. It was about everyone who had watched a system break something delicate, then waited for it to apologize, and never saw it happen. The wave kept growing, without a name, without a leader, just a frequency, one that had started with a single snap, and though Malcolm hadn't added a single word to the fire, he monitored it with the calm of a man who didn't fear chaos, because he understood how to calculate its direction. In his home, the notifications remained unopened. The calls remained unanswered. He sat in the quiet, notebook in hand, listening not to the noise, but to the alignment. The way disparate voices, isolated for so long, now harmonized without a cue. He didn't celebrate, he measured. And as the sun dipped again and the cities across the country hummed with this newfound rhythm, he turned to a blank page and wrote only one sentence. "The truth doesn't need to go viral. It only needs to be heard by the right people at the wrong time." The sentence sat on the page like a trigger left unsqueezed. The truth doesn't need to go viral. It only needs to be heard by the right people at the wrong time. And right on cue, the wrong time arrived. The surge in digital empathy had flooded the front end of the story. The hashtags, the art, the anthems. But now, inevitably, the wave began its pull beneath the surface, and what it uncovered wasn't just the moment a cane cracked. It was the buried spine of a system that had pretended for years that none of this was happening. It began with a leak, not dramatic, just a quiet transfer of one video file from an internal case review archive into the inbox of a journalist with a memory like a blade and nothing to lose. The footage was dated October 2018. The location, a fast food parking lot. The officer, Travis Lasker. The victim, a 34-year-old black man with a below-elbow amputation on his right arm. The charge, non-compliance. The evidence? A body cam angle showing Lasker yelling, "Show me your hands," while the man knelt, visibly shaking his single remaining hand high above his head. "Put the other hand up too," Lasker shouted again. "Now!" When the man said, "I can't, I don't have," he was cut off. Lasker moved fast, body slammed him to the ground, twisted the arm backward, and pinned his face to the concrete. The camera captured the moment. Blood pooled from his mouth, mixed with rainwater and gravel. The man cried out once, then went silent. A female officer off-screen said, "Jesus, Trav," he replied. should have complied. That footage had never been released, never been flagged for misconduct, but its existence meant someone knew. Someone had watched it, reviewed it, and decided this does not rise to concern. Now, unearthed, it went public like a virus made of video. It was time-stamped, geolocated, and confirmed, and when it hit the feeds, it ignited a new level of fury. Because it proved what many already suspected, that Travis Lasker hadn't just snapped a cane, he had been breaking people for years. And someone had made sure the paperwork never mattered. Within hours, the Freedom of Information Act requests flooded in. Independent watchdogs, legal clinics, disability advocacy groups, university law departments. And when the first batch of public records arrived, the rot started speaking for itself. A 2015 complaint filed by a deaf woman alleged that Officer Lasker had pulled her over for erratic signaling, then grew aggressive when she didn't respond to shouted commands. She had tried to point to her wrist, her standard sign for "I'm deaf." His response, according to the complaint, "Stop pretending to be slow, ma'am. This ain't a disability parade." Her file had been marked in red, "No follow-up required, low priority." Another form, this time from 2016, came from a school teacher who witnessed Lasker screaming at a teenage boy outside a convenience store. The boy had cerebral palsy, walked with a limp, and was unable to maintain eye contact. The teacher intervened, stating the child was neurodivergent. Lasker's reply, recorded in a witness statement, was, "You let them act like that long enough, they forget there's still rules." The complaint was submitted. No disciplinary action taken. The file bore a stamped phrase now infamous on activist message boards. Internal review closed, no pattern of misconduct established. The deeper investigators dug, the more the pattern crystallized. This wasn't rogue behavior. This was ritual. A culture of classification, filtration, and erasure, all disguised as procedural discipline. In total, 8 official complaints against Lasker had been filed over 12 years, 5 of them involving disabled civilians, 4 involving the use of force against people with visible or declared impairments. None had triggered formal hearings. None had reached civilian oversight. Then came the file from 2013, the one that truly fractured the dam. A letter from a social worker named Valerie Trent, handwritten, with copies of 3 signed witness statements attached. The letter detailed an encounter between Lasker and a homeless man using a service dog. The dog had barked when Lasker approached. Lasker allegedly shouted, kicked the dog, and threw the man's belongings into a storm drain. "You and your mutt can go beg somewhere else," the statement quoted. Valerie wrote, in closing, "If this is how our officers treat the most vulnerable, what chance do the rest of us have?" A sticky note on the file, scrawled in blue pen, said, "No urgency, not politically sensitive." The internet moved fast, but the bureaucracy had been slower, and now the delay was its evidence. Emails surfaced, internal, dated. One read, "We've received another minor Lasker flare-up. Advise shifting review past quarter to avoid press overlap with community hearing." Another, shorter, colder, "Reduce exposure. Quiet file. Link to fatigue mitigation, not force escalation." Both were marked with executive initials. Amid the paper trail, testimonies started resurfacing. A woman who had been legally blind since birth posted on a disability rights forum. "In 2019, I was walking to my bus stop. I stepped into the crosswalk and heard a voice shout at me to stay on the goddamn curb. That voice, it was him. I didn't see him, but I'll never forget how he made me feel, and I'll never forget that voice." Her account wasn't grand, wasn't violent, but it was familiar, it was repeatable, it was real, and it matched the rhythm of a dozen others. By the end of the week, newsrooms weren't asking if Lasker was a problem. They were asking how many people made him possible. Editorials stopped using words like isolated, accidental, or misjudgment. Instead, they wrote, "This was not a failure of training. This was the success of a design that prioritized deniability." One national outlet opened its segment with a single sentence on screen: "You can escape cameras. You cannot escape history." They then rolled a montage, not of Lasker, but of the people he'd impacted. No faces, just voices. Each one begins with the same phrase: I didn't think anyone would believe me. The footage from 2018 had forced a recalibration, but the files, the patterns, the silence, those forced reckoning. Public defenders began auditing closed cases where Lasker's name appeared. A university legal clinic opened an inquiry into the admissibility of confessions made under his supervision. Civilian boards convened emergency sessions, not to investigate, but to answer a new question. How did we let this continue? The district's spokesperson issued a statement. It was short, sterile. We are reviewing all prior allegations. Officer Lasker is on administrative leave. The statement included no apology, no admission, no commitment. It did not mention Edna Moore's name. It did not mention a cane. But the pressure wasn't from statements now. It was from memory. And the more it was remembered, the less anyone could pretend it was contained. A popular data journalism site published a timeline, 12 incidents over 14 years, mapped with sources, quotes, and agency responses. At the top, a headline in black font, "Not a bad apple, a quiet harvest." And in the center of it all, still unseen, still unnamed, sat the man who had never raised his voice. He did not call press conferences. He did not write op-eds, but he monitored every node of the reaction, not for applause, but for alignment. Because this part, the part where the machine finally admitted it had a memory, was where systems began to lose control, not from outside pressure, from their document, their signatures, their own belief that they were never going to be seen. Because cameras fade, hashtags disappear, but paper, when found, doesn't lie. And this time it had been found. They kept saying he hadn't appeared, and yet everything moved like someone had. Every article, every internal memo, every shifting schedule in a law office or whispered strategy in a courtroom carried a weight no one wanted to name aloud. Malcolm Moore hadn't posted, spoken, or stepped in front of any camera, and still 3 major police departments had restructured their public affairs offices in under 48 hours. Not because of pressure from the press, but because of anticipation. Something was aligning, and it wasn't public outrage, it was coordinated inevitability. A senior advisor from Washington was overheard saying in a closed meeting, if he speaks just once, 3 states might have to investigate their entire police force structures, from top to bottom. But he hadn't spoken. He had done worse. He had stayed silent in a way that made everyone else confess. No one saw him arrive. No one announced his name. But one by one, inboxes began receiving unsigned legal drafts linking previously unrelated complaints into threadable systemic. One by one, former victims were quietly contacted, not by lawyers, not by reporters, but by couriers who offered nothing but a meeting time and a sealed envelope. And across the country, people who had once chosen silence began finding iron canes in the mail, not replicas of Edna Moore's fiberglass guide stick, but solid, heavy, short canes forged from steel. No note, no return address, just weight. People who had once said nothing, former assistant prosecutors, city hall advisors, precinct clerks, opened their doors to find a small box, and inside, a cane that could not be ignored. One woman, a former legal aide who declined to elevate a 2015 complaint for review, opened her box and wept, not out of guilt, but recognition. In her words, it felt like someone sent me back the thing I told myself wasn't real. Meanwhile, across different jurisdictions, law firms that had never collaborated were suddenly sharing precedents. Digital trails showed sealed footage being requested from municipal archives in Baltimore, Oakland, Memphis, and an advocacy nonprofit in San Diego reported receiving a package containing scanned testimony from 3 unrelated cases, all dated within the same 20-day window in 2017, all dismissed by the same internal affairs officer. No signature, but the formatting was unmistakable. It was Malcolm's kind of preparation, flawless, invisible, surgical. Somewhere along the way, a woman who had been pushed into a wall by Travis Lasker back in 2012 was brought privately off camera to a room. Malcolm was already there, standing, waiting. He didn't introduce himself. She knew. She stared at him, her eyes wide but steady, and then she broke. Not from fear, but from something deeper. "I thought no one remembered who I was," she whispered. Malcolm didn't answer. He simply handed her a card. It had no company name, no job title, just 8 embossed words in black ink. Justice is not blind, but it remembers who blinded it. And then he left. Not 10 minutes later, her former testimony reappeared, this time in a legal document cited as precedent. In Chicago, a bartender said casually to a group of off-duty officers, "If it is Malcolm, he's not building a case. He's building a memory the system thought it deleted." No one responded. Across social media, people began noticing the same phrases popping up in different cities. The cane was in her eyes. It was never just one. This silence has fingerprints. A podcast host speculated, "I don't think he's trying to win something. I think he's trying to make it so they can never forget they lost." In Portland, a legal clinic received a flash drive with a folder titled 24. Inside were scanned documents from sealed hearings, redacted witness statements, and time-stamped emails suggesting not only that force protocols had been violated, but that the violations were internally recognized, cataloged, and quietly neutralized. Attached to the drive was a single printed phrase: "The system has a memory. It just needed a witness." By the end of that week, 17 former DOJ investigators signed an open letter calling for federal-level oversight on multi-state complaint suppression. These were not activists. These were retired officials, many of whom hadn't spoken publicly in over a decade. Their closing sentence: "This is no longer about conduct. It is about concealment." No one knew who had coordinated their statement, but some noticed that all 17 had, at some point in their careers, crossed paths with a single unnamed advisor who had a reputation for asking 3-word questions that rewrote entire agency priorities. One newspaper ran a full-page spread with a blank silhouette and the headline, "No one knows what he's coordinating." The article didn't accuse him of anything. It simply listed the coincidences: 23 unexplained resignations, 6 sealed case reevaluations, and over 100 silent reactivations of dormant civil complaints, all within 20 days of Edna Moore's cane snapping in half. When asked to comment, the paper's editor said, "We're not chasing a man. We're following gravity." Even Malcolm's critics didn't call him wrong. They called him inconvenient, and that was always worse. A senator whispered during a private debrief, "He's not a public threat. He's a mirror. That's what makes him dangerous." And still, no official word came, just motion, the motion of silence that no one could stop, the motion of truth being handed back to the people who thought they had lost it forever. Because Malcolm wasn't trying to go viral. He was trying to infect the system with accountability, too contagious to ignore. And now, it was working. He didn't plan the photograph, didn't position himself for it, didn't glance at the lens or shift his posture, and yet it froze the country like a verdict mid-breath, a single frame taken at the exact moment the wind caught the bottom of his coat, and the broken cane in his hand hung like a symbol too heavy to name, his head tilted slightly downward, not in shame but in precision, as though he were listening to something beneath the pavement. Something old and buried and now awakened. Because what made the image unforgettable wasn't its composition or lighting or setting, but the unbearable fact that he wasn't performing at all. And that was what struck first: the absence of drama, the complete rejection of spectacle. The fact that Malcolm Moore was not looking at anyone, and yet everyone suddenly felt seen. And within hours of its appearance online, posted by an anonymous account named @Edna's Son, the photo was no longer just an image. It was a mirror. It was an indictment. It was the stillness before a nationwide breath no one realized they had been holding until they saw him standing alone in that empty street, holding the very cane that had been broken not just physically, but symbolically, and something about the way his fingers wrapped around it, not tight, not relaxed, but with the pressure of memory, told a story that required no caption, no timestamp, no location, and That's why it spread faster than press releases or opinion pieces or viral outrage, because it bypassed the rational brain and lodged itself directly into something deeper, into collective memory, into the part of people that recognizes gravity even if they've never felt it this close. And the first to give it language wasn't a journalist or a lawyer or a politician, but a 12-year-old blind girl in Cleveland who had never seen Malcolm's face and never would, but who had the image described to her in detail by her teacher and then wrote on her device, "He's not a stranger. That's how my father looked at my mother after she was slapped by a deacon in church. Not angry, not scared, just ready." And those words traveled with the photo, not beneath it but inside it, giving voice to what everyone else was still trying to process. While in Detroit, a priest printed the image on the cover of his parish's study booklet, saying during his homily, "Faith does not require that we see, only that we recognize what must not be broken again." And by the end of the week, 72 public schools had mounted the photo in hallways, staff rooms, and cafeterias without permission, without press kits, without branding, just a still image of a man with his back to the camera, a broken cane in hand, and a posture that did not apologize for its silence. And no one defaced those prints. No one demanded they come down, because even those who disagreed with the movement didn't know how to disagree with the photograph itself, because how do you argue with stillness that carries that much truth, that much intent? And though politicians scrambled and police departments issued carefully worded no-comment statements about ongoing discourse, the photo bypassed those responses like a ghost walking through locked doors. And within 48 hours, major newspapers stopped trying to explain it and simply reprint, often full page with no headline, while artists took up brushes and projectors and fabric, creating murals that spilled across city walls, metro stations, and classroom ceilings, some versions abstracted, some hyper-real, but always with the same central image: Malcolm alone, unarmed, unmasked, holding the broken staff of his mother's memory like a contract rewritten in silence. And meanwhile, the man himself said nothing, gave no interviews, posted no clarifications, because what could he possibly add that the world hadn't already felt in that posture? And even when the White House's official account followed at Edna Son, it did so without tweet or explanation, and that silence made more noise than any press conference could have, prompting pundits to argue over what the follow meant, while the people who mattered simply looked at the image again and again and again, until it no longer felt like a news cycle but like a turning point. And perhaps the most devastating power of the photograph was that it did not demand justice. It made the absence of it visible, undeniable, and almost unbearable. And one civil rights lawyer said, "I've worked cases for 25 years, and I've never seen a single image dismantle more strategic defenses than this one," while a cultural historian called it our generation's visual confession. And all of this unfolded without Malcolm saying a word, because his silence had become a language, and that language had been understood by artists and teachers and children, and even by those in power who realized too late that silence cannot be spun. And in a downtown courtroom hallway, a paralegal stared at a printout of the photo taped above the water fountain and whispered, "He's not even facing us, but somehow it feels like he's asking what we're going to do next." And the question lingered in law firms, classrooms, newsrooms, lunchrooms, echoing through a society that had grown used to reacting to noise, but was now being haunted by a single, motionless reply. And in Portland, a music producer who had grown up deaf layered the rhythm of a heartbeat with the texture of silence, and built an ambient track called The Only Photograph, which was used by over 10,000 social media clips without a single paid push, because the photograph wasn't content, it was context, and context doesn't fade. And slowly the conversation began to change, no longer about what had happened, but about what could no longer be denied. And at a public library in Georgia, a librarian printed the photo on the last page of a book on American justice, slipped it between the index and the author bio, no caption, no note, because some truths are final without needing punctuation. And in Malcolm's own neighborhood, Someone spray-painted the sidewalk outside his mother's home with the words, "He didn't pose," he remembered, and even now, no one knew who took the photo, where it had been captured, or how it had been uploaded. Because none of that mattered anymore, not when the image had already done its work, not when a country had already seen itself not in the face of a man, but in the way he refused to turn toward them, and that was the power, that refusal, that withheld gaze, that broken cane, that shadow stretching toward the camera like a warning that the next step would not be art, would not be sentiment, would not be metaphor, but confrontation. And so the photo did not fade, did not dull, did not flatten into nostalgia like so many viral moments do, because it wasn't just about Edna or Malcolm or Travis or Lasker or the cane or the street or the silence or the system. It was about the fact that someone finally stood without needing to declare it, and someone finally remembered what the system had sworn people would forget, and the photograph closed, no chapters. It only opened the door to the one that would follow, where silence would not be enough, where memory would demand accounting, and where the man in the image, still quiet, still unnamed, still not facing the lens, would no longer be the shadow, but the figure casting it. They all saw the photograph, but it wasn't the image that made them sweat. It was the silence surrounding it. The fact that the man in the frame had said nothing, and yet the weight of what they'd withheld began shifting under their feet, as if the entire structure they'd helped keep standing for years was now tilting toward collapse. Not because of noise, but because of memory, and memory has no mercy when it returns without a knock. And so it began, not with a press release, not with a journalist's expose, but with the voice of a man who no longer owed anyone silence. Lieutenant Harold Penn, retired, disgraced, once demoted for reasons he was told not to ask about again, now 72 and sitting in a borrowed folding chair in front of an old webcam in his niece's apartment, blinking into the digital glare and speaking 12 words before the world even realized it was listening. I was demoted for filing a complaint against Officer Travis Lasker, followed by silence, followed by a slow hand reaching into a manila envelope and pulling out a document so creased it looked like it had aged a decade just from being hidden, and when he began reading, it wasn't with fire or fury, it was with the calm of a man who had waited too long to pretend anymore, reciting each word as if they were names at a memorial. On March 3, 2012, Officer Travis Lasker used force against a handcuffed suspect seated on a curb with no visual sign of resistance. The force included 2 instances of body slamming and 1 instance of verbal degradation, including the phrase, "You sit like that because you got nothing in you worth standing for. I witnessed this myself. I wrote this report." It was denied entry to the disciplinary system by Captain Raymond Niles, citing procedural ambiguity. I was reassigned the next week. Then Harold looked up directly into the camera, eyes glassy but locked, and said, "I want this entered into the record now. Not the department's record, the country's, and the feed cut only when he chose to end it, no interruptions, no edits, just the sound of a man uncaging a sentence 12 years after it was written." And from that moment the myth began to unravel, because it wasn't just Travis anymore. It was the weight of those who knew and said nothing, those who rewrote reports, those who used phrases like behavioral incident instead of abuse, those who told young officers to let things go if they wanted to stay, and suddenly the spotlight that had burned Lasker's name into national memory turned sideways, scanning every hallway, every closed-door meeting, every denied transfer request and internally squashed complaint. And as the old lieutenant's video circled the net like a returning boomerang nobody expected to land, a second crack formed when an internal memo surfaced from the Department of Public Integrity, dated June 2019, top corner stamped in red, confidential / for command review only, and beneath the heading a single sentence: "Do not engage or initiate disciplinary measures against Officer Lasker unless cleared by regional liaison, guidance, issued from executive channels." No signature, no justification, just a structure built on 2 assumptions: that silence would hold and that no one would ever dig up the basement, but Now the basement had been unlocked, and worse, people had started walking through it with flashlights and microphones and old receipts, and then the next voice arrived. Not shouted, not screamed, but spoken quietly during a sit-down interview on a channel known more for its community gardening segments than its political weight, where Officer Dana Reyes, 10 years on the force, clean record, no social media footprint, sat across from a local host and recounted a moment in 2016 when she witnessed Travis Lasker slap a 14-year-old autistic student who had failed to respond to a verbal command, and she detailed how she had written a report that night, how it had gone through standard channels, and how the next morning her supervisor returned it to her with a pink Post-it note bearing 3 words, a phrase for instability, and when she asked what that meant, the answer was clear: make the kid the problem. And so she rewrote it, and she hated herself for it, and she carried that rewritten paragraph like a tumor inside her until this week, when she finally said aloud, on tape, "I've failed that kid, but I'm not going to fail in silence too." And with her testimony came a ripple effect, not from the crowd, but from inside the institution, because once the spell of invincibility around Lasker was broken, other stories began surfacing. Not anonymous, not hearsay, but documented and denied accounts now crawling their way out of file cabinets and corrupted hard drives, like the 2015 report filed by a probationary officer in District 7 alleging that Travis had pinned a pregnant woman against her vehicle during a traffic stop and told her, "It's not about the baby, it's about respect," and how that report was reviewed and buried under the classification stress-induced exaggeration by an internal affairs coordinator, now retired with full pension, and even that might have faded again if not for the final nail. An internal video never meant to leave the precinct walls, leaked anonymously and now viewed over 15 million times, in which the current police chief, during a staff briefing just months before the cane snapping incident, was recorded saying to his team, "Lasker is covered, you are not. Keep complaints off the books unless you're ready for the blowback. He's not your liability, he's someone else's investment." And that sentence, "someone else's investment," was the sentence that made the room shake, because suddenly every officer who had ever said nothing felt named. And the morning after the video broke, the chief submitted his resignation letter, citing emergent medical needs, and disappeared from public view entirely. And what followed was not a collapse, but a slow unpeeling, one officer after another confirming that complaints had been discouraged, that complaints had been reworded, that complaints had been absorbed, a word one captain used during a deposition that now reads more like an obituary for a career than a defense. And all of this unfolded not because the public was screaming, but because silence had finally turned inward, exposing the weight of complicity not in what was done, but in what was allowed. And in the center of it all, Malcolm Moore remained unspoken but present, like gravity in a building now learning what happens when you build foundations on redacted footnotes and good intentions that wilt under heat. And as reports were reopened and names refiled and oversight boards suddenly found their calendars full again, the voice of the retired lieutenant echoed quietly beneath it all, not angry, not vengeful, just honest, when he said, "I'm not brave for speaking now. I'm guilty for waiting this long." And with that sentence, every silence that had once felt like protection began to sting like a scar someone else could now see. And there, in the ruins of everything Lasker left behind, were the names of those who knew and said nothing, not burned into stone, but etched into paper, report after report after report. It wasn't the sound of a gavel or a headline that made the country pause next. It was a voice, not loud, not rehearsed, not broadcast with fanfare or video feeds, but played through the soft crackle of a national podcast episode that had begun like any other until a familiar name appeared in the description, and the host, without music, without introduction, said only, "Today we bring you the voice of Edna Moore." And then the silence stretched just long enough to make the first sentence feel like a verdict. "I don't need to see his face. I just need to smell the way people look down on you." And across tens of thousands of kitchens, earbuds, dashboards, and courthouse hallways, the country froze. not because of who was speaking, but because of how she spoke, with a voice aged not by time but by restraint, by the effort it takes to keep standing when the ground keeps trying to forget you. And she did not sound like someone seeking pity. She sounded like someone who had grown tired of watching everyone else wait for permission to say what they already knew, and when the interviewer asked, almost too carefully, "Are you afraid?" Edna replied with a pause that cut cleaner than any monologue, "I'm blind, not deaf. I've heard the footsteps of cowards my whole life. They don't scare me. They just make me tired." And it was in that moment that a hush fell over the airwaves. A reverence not for her pain, but for her precision, because Edna didn't waste words, she carved with them. And when she began to speak of the first time she had been assaulted, not last week, not last year, but in 1983, when she was 24 and demanded the right to teach Braille in a public classroom, her voice didn't shake, it sharpened. They didn't like that I could teach something they didn't understand, said I was confusing the children, said I was making a scene. But the truth is, they just didn't want someone like me telling them they weren't the only ones who could see. And then, quieter but no less direct, the officer who hit me that day wore a badge, he wore a belt, he wore the uniform of the city, but he didn't wear decent clothes, he didn't wear dignity. He wore power like a rented suit, and it didn't fit, and that sentence, clipped and measured and lethal in its clarity, spread through social media not as a trending soundbite, but as a clip people sent to each other like a warning, like a lesson, like a lighthouse finally visible after decades of fog. And the podcast didn't interrupt her, didn't edit her cadence, didn't slice her experience into digestible outrage. It simply let her speak, and for 3 minutes and 17 seconds she did, uninterrupted, uncompromising, her tone never rising, never cracking, never asking for anyone's sympathy, only refusing to be forgotten. And it was that refusal that struck hardest, because she didn't beg to be seen, she told the country what it had refused to admit. Blind people know what rooms feel like when we enter. We know who shifts, who sighs, who smirks. I don't need your eyes to know your fear. I hear it in your stillness. I smell it in your tone. And people listened, not like they listened to news, but like they listened to confession. Because what Edna offered wasn't a story, it was evidence, and the kind that didn't need validation because it had survived neglect. And when the podcast ended, there was no applause, no outro, just silence, the kind that follows something final, and still the clip traveled, crossing platforms, languages, headlines, translated by volunteers into over 20 dialects, re-uploaded with captions, reshared by journalists, celebrities, teachers, students, but always preserved in its original form. No music, no introduction, just Edna Moore and her truth. And what made the nation sit upright wasn't the sound of her voice, it was the posture of it, the way every word stood like a witness called to testify after everyone else had failed to show up. And across editorial rooms and government offices and living rooms, people didn't ask if she was right. They asked why it took this long to hear her at all. And when one outlet ran the headline, "The woman who couldn't see but never stopped watching," the backlash was immediate, not from critics, but from her supporters, who understood exactly what had happened. She hadn't waited for the world to look her way, she had simply kept speaking until the world ran out of places to hide. And in response to her broadcast, 3 public officials issued formal statements of acknowledgement, not apology, and each one quoted her directly, not for optics, but because no one dared to paraphrase her now. And meanwhile, in her home, Edna remained offline, unaware of the storm she'd centered, and when asked by her grandson what she thought of going viral, she reportedly smiled and said, "It's not viral if it's the truth. It's just finally contagious," and those words, too, joined the mosaic of lines now etched into protest banners and classroom walls and courtroom petitions, not as slogans but as footnotes of a voice that didn't ask to be echoed, only repeated until remembered. And as institutions scrambled to position themselves next to her words, without being pierced by them, Edna returned to her morning routine, brewed her tea, and moved from one side of the house to the other using a new cane, one she had requested not to be white but black, not because of symbolism, but because I want them to stop pretending they don't see me. And she didn't wait for headlines, didn't ask for monuments, didn't request meetings with anyone, because Edna Moore wasn't an icon, she was an instrument of recall, of reckoning, of the kind of accountability that doesn't speak often, but when it does, you realize it's been waiting for you the whole time. And as her 3-minute testimony continued to ripple outward, touching those who thought they were too far removed to be part of the story, one thing became painfully clear. The woman they thought was invisible had been observing the whole system better than anyone with 20/20 vision ever had, and now that she had spoken, nothing that came after could pretend it hadn't heard her. It would have been easy to sue the man who broke the cane, to point at a single name and call it justice, to give the public the neat narrative it craved, a villain, a verdict, a headline that ends on a gavel. And Malcolm knew that, knew the machinery of outrage well enough to know when to reject its currency. So when the press assembled in a room too quiet for the number of cameras it held, and the microphones clustered like a nest of waiting mouths, he didn't wear black, didn't dress like a warrior or a mourner. He wore the same gray coat from the photograph, and when he spoke, he didn't raise his voice. He sharpened it. He said only, "If I sue the man who broke the cane, I'm forgiving the machine that built his hand." In that instant, the storyline changed, because this wasn't a vendetta. It was demolition wrapped in restraint. When the questions came, why not go after Lasker directly? Why not pursue criminal charges? Malcolm remained still and replied, because the man who broke the cane was not malfunctioning, he was functioning exactly as designed. Then he reached into his briefcase and laid out a document on the podium, 182 pages thick, not bound with flair, not printed on glossy paper, just facts. Dates, names, violations, refusals, cover-ups, settlements, threats, transfers, each one connected not by theory, but by record, a spiderweb of procedural rot that stretched far beyond a single wrist or sidewalk or shattered cane. At the top of the cover sheet in capital letters were the words, "Structural failure, a pattern of sustained suppression in the 8-precinct zone." Beneath it, 37 documented incidents involving 8 separate officers over 9 years. Each one was mishandled in almost identical ways. Malcolm didn't dramatize them, didn't read them aloud like poetry, he submitted them. First to the Department of Justice, then to the press, and finally and most precisely to 12 separate international human rights commissions across Geneva, The Hague, Vienna, and New York. Each file was accompanied by a letter that began with the sentence, "This is not a plea. This is an audit." Legal analysts scrambled, not because of the contents. They were devastating, yes, but also precise, airtight, delivered without emotion, but because of the method, the clarity, the coldness of it. One retired civil rights lawyer, seasoned by decades of battle, admitted on air, "This is not a lawsuit. It's a structural proposition, and it's written by a mind that sees 10 layers beneath policy." No one knew how to respond, because Malcolm wasn't accusing, he was documenting, and that distinction changed everything. Accusations demand a defense. Documentation demands dismantling. That was the difference. He wasn't demanding heads, he was showing the foundation, and asking why it hadn't been condemned. Reporters began reading the document in real time, discovering the patterns. The same language is used in internal memos, the same deflections, the same red ink across witness reports marked non-critical. The same 2-word phrase appeared across 14 cases, behaviorally volatile, a phrase used on a blind woman, a disabled veteran, a deaf teenager, a nonverbal child. When asked if he had considered seeking damages, Malcolm answered with the sharpest sentence of the day, "I am not here for compensation. I am here to collapse the scaffolding that held him up." For a moment, no one in the room moved. They realized they weren't attending a press conference. They were attending the reading of an indictment that had no judge, no jury, only a public too slow to realize it had already been called to witness. Quietly, behind the scenes, law firms began meeting, State officials began calling each other. The precinct launched an internal preliminary review. Oversight boards that had once ignored complaints began asking for full histories. But Malcolm didn't wait for them to catch up, because this wasn't about pace, it was about proof, and proof has a weight that doesn't change with opinion. When one anchor asked whether he was seeking to make an example of Travis Lasker, he replied, "If I stop at one man, I am telling every other man that his silence was safe." That line detonated across the networks, not shouted, not rehearsed, but delivered with the clarity of someone who had already decided not to explain himself further. By the end of the day, major media outlets stopped using Lasker's name in their headlines. They replaced it with terms like wider exposure, statewide investigation, and systemic coordination. A senator from Vermont, in a rare moment of candor, tweeted, "We are watching a masterclass in accountability. It's not revenge, it's the blueprint." Malcolm said nothing more that day, but the document kept speaking for him. Page by page, legal scholars dissected it, law students studied it, victims recognized themselves in it. And those who had once whispered their truths behind closed doors now saw those whispers typed, footnoted, cross-referenced, and submitted into the public domain. Slowly, the country began to understand what it was looking at. Not a victim reclaiming dignity, but a strategist refusing to let the world make his mother's pain into a single-issue headline. In the middle of all that exposure, Travis Lasker, still suspended, still uncharged, was no longer the center of the story, because the real narrative had outgrown him, outpaced him, erased him, not with forgiveness, but with irrelevance. Somewhere in a quiet office, a federal clerk received a second envelope from Malcolm Moore, not labeled, not urgent, but time-stamped. Inside was a single sentence typed alone on the page. "When a machine breaks a human, we don't blame the hammer, we inspect the design." No one knew what would happen next, but everyone understood that something had already begun, and it would not be stopped by apologies or settlements or retirements, because the man they thought was here to fight, one man had just submitted plans to gut the building. The building wasn't meant for this kind of pressure. It had hosted state hearings, budget negotiations, even a few nationally broadcast trials, but nothing like what began unfolding the morning the emergency session was convened. The front steps were lined before sunrise. By 7 a.m., barricades had been hauled into place. Security doubled, then tripled. Inside, the air didn't move. Not for malfunction. This wasn't just a meeting, it was a reckoning. The room filled slowly, methodically. Witnesses seated row by row, staffers thumbing through boxes of printed transcripts, audio files, and chain of custody reports. No one smiled. No one muttered. This was not a spectacle. This was memory being summoned to testify. When the committee chair finally entered, no introduction was needed. No pledge, no anthem, just silence. And then a voice over the intercom announced what the crowd already knew. The emergency oversight hearing regarding structural misconduct in the state's 8th precinct jurisdiction was now in session, and for the first time in recorded history, a badge wasn't the subject, it was the evidence. They began with documents, familiar, reviewed, and archived. Then came audio. A clip from 2016, no visual, just a crackle, then a voice, unmistakable, recorded during a shift change. Blind folks should stay home, ain't nothing those sticks can teach the street. Laughter followed. Then a second voice, uncertain, tried to interject, then silence. The clip ended. No one needed the name identified, but the record stated it anyway. Officer Travis Lasker, badge 7443. A beat passed. Then the committee chair looked up, adjusted his microphone, and called the next speaker. She stood slowly, 14 years old, glasses darkened though the room was dim. She held no folder, no notes, just a page she had memorized. Her name was Taylor Morris, and what she read made every camera in the room zoom in tighter, not on her face, but on the words spilling from her mouth. "I didn't see who shoved me that day. I didn't see the hallway. I didn't see the glare, but I heard the footstep, and I smelled the fear. Not mine, theirs. They were afraid of being caught helping me. So they didn't." She paused. swallowed, continued. Today, I still don't see faces, but I know exactly who helped cover them. No applause, but the room exhaled. The kind of breath people take after hearing a verdict without needing a judge. 3 seats away, a former precinct clerk looked down at her shoes. A man in a tie beside her blinked hard. A staffer closed his laptop. Next came the files. One by one, projected onto the screen behind the panel. Not headlines, not summaries, just lines of repetition, ignored, rephrased, dismissed, internally resolved. Then a chair scraped the floor. A man in uniform stood, young, crisp collar, face tight. He walked forward, not called, not scheduled, placed his badge on the witness table. "I can't wear this anymore," he said, voice not cracking, not rising. "I won't let this die with my dignity attached." He stepped back, didn't ask to be heard, didn't need to. The badge sat there like a resignation letter that didn't require a signature. Someone shifted uncomfortably on the panel. A councilwoman whispered to an aide. The air grew hotter, not from temperature, from accumulation. Next came a tape, low quality, captured by a dashboard mic. It wasn't Lasker's voice this time, it was a captain. These types of complaints, they don't go anywhere. People forget. The media moves on. Just make sure no paperwork trails. They didn't play anymore. They didn't need to. The pattern was now public. The machine no longer denied its blueprint. Then came the final crack. A committee member, third from the left, cleared his throat, adjusted his notes, said into the microphone, "We must consider the context. I mean, perhaps some of the reactions here are overstated." The word hung like smoke. In the back of the room, someone stood. Then another. Then something flew. An egg, arcing through the light, exploding on the table in front of him. Gasps, shouts. Security surged forward, but no one screamed. They just stared, because for the first time it wasn't just pain in the room. It was rage that had stopped asking permission to speak. The hearing adjourned early, not from disorder, but from recognition. The system had been called by its name, and this time the people didn't whisper it. They declared it, under oath. The image that stopped the country wasn't dramatic. There was no flag waving, no crowd behind him, no expression of fury, just Malcolm Moore standing alone in front of the Capitol, holding a broken white cane, not like a weapon, not like a trophy, but like a receipt. And beneath the photograph, printed on the cover of Time, 4 words in red serif font: "He never raised his voice." By the time it hit the newsstands, Malcolm had already delivered his first and only public statement, not as an architect, not as an advisor, not as a strategist, but as a son. Cameras didn't capture him walking to the podium. They didn't need to. The silence that accompanied his first step said everything the microphones couldn't. He stood still, not adjusting his notes, not checking the prompter. And when he spoke, it was not with the rhythm of a prepared speech. It was with the calm of someone who had waited decades not to shout. "My mother never asked to be treated differently," he began. "But she carried enough history in her bones to prove why some things must never be allowed to repeat." The sentence didn't echo. It landed. And then everything paused, not from confusion, but from understanding. Malcolm wasn't speaking to the press. He was speaking past them, directly to the country that had built its comfort on her silence. He didn't invoke tragedy. He didn't leverage pain. He held up a mirror, and each word he delivered felt like a line being carved into marble. She taught children how to read without seeing. She taught adults how to lead without power. She taught me how to stand in a room full of well-dressed men and remember which one of us had earned the right to speak. There were no applause breaks, no camera pans, just his voice, and the fact that no one interrupted it. Within hours, the clip was replayed across every major outlet, but none of them could cut it into sound bites. Not without dulling its blade. Malcolm's name for the first time became searchable. It shot to number 3 on the National Trending Index, right below the President and Beyoncé. And yet no one could find a single prior interview, no biography, no memoir, just a list of published legal strategies he never signed, initiatives he advised from the shadows, policy shifts that happened without clear authorship. He hadn't appeared. He had orchestrated. And now the curtain was pulled. A former senator said, "He just took 30 years of restraint and dropped it like a gavel on the country's conscience." Opponents scrambled. One opposition figure, known for her brash media takes, accused Malcolm of weaponizing narrative for political gain. She expected the usual backlash, online outrage, op-eds, perhaps a scathing segment on late-night television. What she received instead was a 3-page dossier uploaded by an independent advocacy group detailing Malcolm's role in defending 3 landmark discrimination cases involving people with disabilities, 2 of which had resulted in national policy amendments. The final page included excerpts from court records, including one moment when Malcolm, uncredited, had orchestrated the passage of an emergency injunction at 217 AUI to stop the deportation of a blind asylum seeker who had no family and no representation. The backlash turned. Not against Malcolm, against her. Within 36 hours, she stated a retraction. It didn't include the word sorry, but it included his name. And that was enough to confirm what the country now knew. This was not a man stepping into the light for praise. This was a man stepping out of the dark only to say, "I was here the entire time. You just chose not to see me." In one viral video, a college professor replayed his speech in class and paused after his second sentence, then asked her students, "How many of you thought justice had a volume knob?" No one answered, because they had all just heard what it sounded like when justice whispered. Malcolm gave no interviews. He didn't join the morning shows. He didn't release a follow-up statement. But his presence filled every silence now. Public murals emerged, not of his face, but of his silhouette beside Edna's cane. Church shirts were printed with the phrase, "Not revenge, just the record." When asked if he intended to enter politics, his office replied with a single sentence, "Power doesn't need a title. It needs a function." He refused all campaign invitations, declined honorary degrees, sent back 2 commemorative plaques with a note that read, "I do not want to be honored by the same rooms that once ignored her." No monuments were requested, no foundations launched. But within 10 days of his speech, 6 major cities voted to reopen their citizen complaint databases for public audit. And across universities, law students began organizing clinics under the name Moore Method, a term they coined after reading the 182-page brief he submitted, not as litigation, but as instruction. Malcolm didn't capitalize on the moment. He collapsed it into movement, and behind it all, one image remained. Him, on the steps, not smiling, not waving, just holding a broken cane, upright like a compass, the country finally chose to follow. The letter was dated March 18, 2017, typed in black ink, neatly formatted, signed at the bottom with a name that would mean nothing to the people who received it. Margaret Penn, public school teacher, legally blind, 38 years in the system. 17 of those spent training disabled students to navigate public spaces without fear, and attached to the letter was a simple photo, grainy, low resolution, a white cane bent almost in half, the rubber tip smeared with dirt and something darker, maybe blood. The image wasn't sensational, it was quiet, like most warnings are, before they're ignored. Margaret had written to the district's internal review board after one of her students came back from school police intervention, trembling, unable to explain what happened but repeating the same sentence over and over. "He told me I was walking like I thought I owned the place." The boy hadn't resisted, he hadn't spoken back, he had simply walked down the wrong hallway, in the wrong posture, with the wrong disability. The officer's name wasn't given, but Margaret heard it from a janitor 3 days later, Travis Lasker. The name didn't shock her. She had heard whispers before, seen redacted reports, comforted students who didn't know how to describe humiliation because they'd never been taught the vocabulary of abuse. So she documented what she could, sent it by fax, and waited. The letter was never answered. Weeks passed, then months, years. When the national investigation finally unearthed the archive of unresolved complaints, Margaret's was among the oldest. The copy of her fax had survived, but not unmarked. At the top corner, in a faint blue pen, someone had written, "Too many like this one. No capacity." Below that, another note, "Not actionable, budget already exceeded." There were no signatures, no stamps, just apathy, penciled in by bureaucracy. When Margaret finally spoke to the press, 6 years too late for prevention, but just in time for reckoning, her tone wasn't bitter, it was exact. She said, "I never saw his face, but I remember the smell of fear on my student's coat. It wasn't sweet, it wasn't panic, it was a resignation. The kind that only comes when a child learns too early that no one's coming to help." She didn't cry, she didn't raise her voice, she didn't accuse anyone by name. She simply made it impossible for the country to look away. And when the audio leaked, a recording from an internal budget planning session in 2018, where a district official was heard saying, "We can't allocate resources for these kinds of complaints. If we did, we'd never fund a graduation ceremony." It wasn't the cruelty that hurt, it was the banality. They weren't ignoring victims, they were budgeting around them. Margaret didn't want compensation. She didn't want apologies. She wanted acknowledgement. And when it finally came, it didn't arrive as a statement. It arrived in silence. The kind of silence that settles over a room when truth walks in and everyone realizes they already knew it, but no one wanted to be the first to say it out loud. That was when the students decided, not with protest signs, not with hashtags, with canes. They gathered in the gymnasium of the school where Margaret once taught, now converted into a resource center for students with disabilities. No banners, no press, just one long table draped in gray cloth. One by one, the students approached. They didn't speak, they didn't perform. Each of them placed a white cane on the table. Some were new, some worn. Some still bore names scratched faintly into the plastic. The sound of each cane touching wood was soft, but in that room, it sounded like thunder. When they finished, they stood behind the table, heads bowed. No speech, no music. Just 32 young people who had once been told they were overreacting, now standing together in absolute, indisputable clarity. Margaret stood behind them. She didn't need a microphone. She spoke one sentence. "We warned you. You chose not to read." Then she turned and left the room. The image went viral, not because it was flashy, but because it was final. A teacher, a table, and 32 students who had survived the system that pretended they didn't exist. Time didn't cover it. The Washington Post ran only a sidebar, but communities across the country printed the photo in school hallways. They labeled it the Table of Unread Letters. In a follow-up interview, Margaret said, "People keep asking me if I'm angry. I'm not. I'm tired. Tired of yelling into filing cabinets. Tired of training kids to advocate for themselves when I know the system's built to outweight them. Tired of watching warnings become obituaries." And that was the word she used, obituaries, because that's what most complaints become when they go unanswered. Margaret didn't say it with drama. She said it with precision. And the country, for once, had the decency not to interrupt. He didn't expect a crowd, but he expected something, a protest, a chant, maybe even a shove. But when Travis Lasker stepped out of the precinct for the last time, wearing a plain gray shirt and jeans that still hung like regulation, what he saw wasn't fury, it was an absence. The silence wasn't passive, it was curated. There were people there, maybe 50, maybe 100, but none of them looked at him, not one. They turned their backs, quietly, not angrily, deliberately, like they were shutting a book that had already taken too many pages, to say nothing. He paused on the steps, expecting someone to say something. A word, a slur, a name, but all he got was the sound of shoes moving away. That was the thing about social expulsion. It didn't shout, it withdrew. And when it withdrew, it didn't take noise with it. It took air. His badge had been surrendered 2 days prior. No ceremony, no final handshake, just a form and a locked drawer. The word terminated was never used. The paperwork said, "Administrative dismissal pending formal review." But the review never came. No one fought for him, no one objected. No union rep showed up to file a grievance. The building had forgotten him before the exit door closed behind his shoulder. Across the street, someone held a sign, not high, just at chest level. It read, "We don't serve those who strike the blind." The words were printed in black. The font was simple. The sign was mounted next to the entrance of a coffee shop he used to visit every Thursday. The barista he once joked with refused to make eye contact. She looked past him, called the next name. He wasn't on the cup anymore. 3 blocks away, someone had spray-painted the side of an abandoned bus stop shelter. The words were fresh. "The Canbrake bus, so did your name." No one cleaned it. No one claimed it. But the neighborhood newsletter featured it in a photo series titled Voices on Walls, and no one asked to blur the image. Later that afternoon, a message began to circulate online, just a screenshot. A text message thread, allegedly between Travis's son and a classmate. The boy had written, "I don't want to go to school. They said I'd probably break people's canes too. I don't even know what that means, but I don't want to be him." The screenshot wasn't verified. It didn't need to be. The ache in it was real, and real pain rarely asks for footnotes. No one came to his defense. No public figure spoke of overreach. No columnist argued nuance. Even the far-right forums remained quiet, uncertain how to spin a man whose silence had exposed more than any policy could hide. Travis wasn't martyred, he was muted. At the grocery store, people didn't confront him, they simply shifted. Cartwheels turned away. Children asked questions in whispers they didn't think he could hear. But he heard them. "Is that the man from the video? The one who said blind people shouldn't walk? Why doesn't he have his uniform?" No one stopped them. No one corrected them. The correction had already been delivered, publicly, quietly, repeatedly. His mailbox became a collection of absence, subscriptions canceled, bills forwarded, invitations rescinded. A flyer for a neighborhood cookout had his address crossed out in pen, not scribbled, struck cleanly, like a name removed from a guest list. And then came the sign, the one someone planted near the edge of his lawn overnight, laminated, taped to a wooden stake. Just one sentence, written in white on black. "The cane is broken, but you no longer have a name worth leaning on." He stared at it for 10 minutes, never touched it, just read it, over and over. There were no bricks through his window, no protests outside his home, just the soft, persistent sound of a life being uninvited from itself. At the gym, his membership was marked inactive. No reason given. System error, they said. The receptionist didn't smile when she said it. She didn't frown, either. She just handed him the printout and waited for him to leave. He did. That night, in the dim yellow of a hallway light that flickered like it had forgotten how to stay, Travis sat at the edge of his bed. No phone calls, no emails, no noise. Just a stillness that had once felt like control. Now it felt like a consequence. He looked at the drawer where his badge used to be. The drawer was empty, but the space still held the shape of it. That's the thing about symbols. They don't vanish. They rot in plain sight. He reached for the remote, turned on the TV. Every channel had moved on, but the silence hadn't. It followed him, not with rage, not with protest, with absence. A kind of justice no judge could administer, a kind of shame no press release could deflect. The final punishment wasn't the loss of title. It wasn't the end of the salary or the empty locker or the avoidance in grocery aisles. It was the realization that the uniform hadn't protected him. It had merely hidden him. And now, stripped of it, all that remained was a man who had been seen too clearly by a country that had finally learned how to stare back. The first attempt at reconciliation came from the governor's office. A press release wrapped in caution, stamped with phrases like "moving forward" and "healing together." No one responded. So they sent letters, printed on fine linen paper, signed in ink, folded into ceremonial envelopes. One of those letters made its way to the School for the Blind, where Margaret Penn had once taught. It didn't make it past the front desk. A staff member opened it, read it in full, walked outside, and shredded it by hand. No media. No performance, just slow, deliberate tearing, as if undoing a lie word The paper didn't flutter in the wind. It fell heavily, like it knew it hadn't been earned. There were no calls for protest, no petitions, no counterstatement, because the silence wasn't waiting for permission anymore. It had become a decision. When the state organized a community reconciliation ceremony, only one person showed up, a child, 8, maybe 9. He didn't say a word, just walked to the center of the empty square, stood alone under the dull city light, pulled a white cane from his backpack, stood it upright on the concrete, and walked away. The cane remained, trembling slightly from the wind. The footage lasted 18 seconds. It was posted by a city employee who hadn't planned to record anything. The video was shared over 5 million times in 48 hours. No one added music. No one overlaid text. The clip didn't need editing. It was already perfect in its indictment. People didn't demand justice anymore. They expected it. And what they didn't expect, they replaced with ritual. Schools began to adopt a new practice. Once a month, a day called Silent to See. On that day, no one was required to speak in class. Teachers lectured in complete silence, using gestures, written notes, and signs. Every instructor wore blackout glasses, not as a costume, but as a confession. At first, some questioned the idea, thought it was symbolic at best. But by the third session, students began describing what they had felt. Not blindness, but helplessness. Not confusion, but exposure. One teacher wrote afterward, "I've never heard so much in a room with no sound." Her words were printed in every major educational journal that year. No one asked her to write them. No one asked anyone to speak anymore. The country had finally discovered that certain truths do not require amplification, only memory. In a small town in Missouri, a church canceled its Sunday service. Not out of protest, out of principle. The pastor had read Edna's words aloud the night before during a youth group meeting. The line she had once spoken so plainly, "Blindness is not the sin. Contempt is what makes us lose our way." It echoed, not in outrage, but in agreement. The next morning, instead of hymns and sermons, the congregation sat in silence while her words were recited in fragments by children who could barely pronounce them, but understood them better than most adults ever would. The collection plate that morning held no money, only folded slips of paper. On each was written a sentence beginning with, "I saw," and ending with, "but I stayed quiet." The pile grew. When reporters asked whether this was a trend, the pastor answered, "Trends are for things that pass. This isn't passing, it's settling." And settle it did. Into universities, into city councils, into kitchen tables. People stopped asking when justice would arrive. They started asking how long it had been missing without anyone noticing. Some attempted to shift the tone, tried to suggest that perhaps it was time to reclaim civility, that perhaps too much had been said, but those voices didn't carry far. Not because they were shouted down, but because no one turned to hear them. The world wasn't shouting anymore. It was choosing what not to hear. There was no forgiveness campaign, no staged embrace, no photo op with former victims. Because the victims weren't interested in performing closure, they were interested in permanence, in the idea that some things once broken should not be glued back together, but examined until everyone understood why they shattered in the first place. And when the Department of Justice quietly asked if any of the affected families would like to participate in a restorative dialogue program, the answer returned in a stack of blank forms, signed, dated, all reading. Participation declined, not because they hated, but because they remembered. No speeches were made, no essays submitted, but slowly, quietly, white canes began appearing in places they hadn't been before. One leaned against the wall of a courtroom lobby. One was left at the front steps of the state capitol, tied with a note, "This is not yours to break again." One was found in the break room of a police station in Minnesota. No fingerprints, no message, just the presence of something fragile standing upright in the room where silence used to win. Forgiveness didn't die. It simply wasn't needed, because no one had asked for it, and more importantly, no one had earned it. There was no announcement, no broadcast, no phone call or calendar event. It began like the rest of her mornings did, quiet, deliberate, and surrounded by the gentle textures of a world she had long since learned to feel rather than see. Edna sat by the window, where the light always warmed her left shoulder first. The same chair, the same wooden floor beneath her slippered feet, her fingers resting on the pages of a raised letter book she had read so often that the creases were shaped more by memory than motion. The sound of the wind had a familiar rasp that day, like it was carrying something it didn't want to drop. When the knock came, it didn't break the silence, it joined it. 3 slow taps, firm but not urgent. She didn't ask who it was. The door was unlocked, and somehow she knew. The footsteps were hesitant, not out of fear, but respect. The man stepped into the room like someone entering a church, with no faith left, but too much memory to stay away. He didn't wear a uniform. He wore gray, plain, nothing to indicate role or rank. He didn't salute, didn't introduce himself. He walked across the room and, without a word, knelt beside her. Not to be beneath her, but to be level with her. She didn't flinch. She didn't lean back. Her face was turned slightly toward the sound of his breathing. He carried something in his hands, a cane. Not white, not bright, not gleaming like some performative gift, was matte, quiet, weighted just enough to feel real, balanced, sturdy, and at the handle, carved into the grain with neither arrogance nor apology, were 4 words. This time, it stands. He didn't offer it like a gift. He placed it in her palm as if returning something that had always belonged to her, something the world had taken without permission and now knew better than to keep. She didn't ask his name. She didn't need to. She ran her fingers across the engraving, slow, precise, as if confirming that the words hadn't been painted on, hadn't been added for show, but had been pressed into the wood with intention. She didn't thank him. She didn't speak. Her grip tightened slightly, not because it was heavy, but because she understood what it meant to hold something that had once been broken and now returned, not whole, but chosen. He stood, still no words, just a nod, and then he left, quietly, like an apology not spoken but delivered in full. Later that afternoon, a photo appeared online. No one knew who took it. No one claimed credit. It wasn't staged. It wasn't even in focus, but it captured her hand, wrinkled and firm, wrapped around the handle of the cane. The rest of the frame was blurred. The chair, the window, the shoulder of the man already halfway out the door. The image didn't show faces. It didn't need to. It wasn't about identity. It was about return. The caption below the photo simply read, "Returned not because it broke, but because we should never let it break again." No hashtags, no filters, just silence that said, enough. The photo spread not because of virality, but because people understood, instantly, what it meant to return something without asking for forgiveness. There were rumors, of course, that the man was a former student of Edna's, that he had been orphaned, that she had taught him Braille when no one else had wanted to teach him anything, that she had let him spell his name before he could pronounce it, that her hands had guided his when the world refused to. But Edna never confirmed those stories, and the man never surfaced again, because this wasn't about him. This wasn't about redemption. This was about restoration without permission, about repair without applause. She didn't mount the cane on the wall. She didn't display it in the glass. She placed it beside her door, where it would be used. Not worshipped, used. Because justice isn't a monument. It's a tool. And sometimes the greatest power is not in the holding, but in the quiet agreement that some things deserve to stand, not for what they are, but for what they mean. Over the following weeks, canes began appearing in other places. One was left at the foot of a courthouse, wrapped in a ribbon bearing no message. Another leaned against the wall of a subway station, upright, steady, watching a world that had learned to glance away less. And in a police precinct across the country, someone found a cane left in the break room, its handle scratched with the word "Remember." No one claimed it, no one removed it, because some symbols aren't left behind. They're planted. Edna never mentioned the visit, never referred to the man or the gesture, but when visitors entered her home, they all noticed the cane. And somehow, they all knew not to ask. It stood there like an oath, like a sentence that didn't need a verb. It didn't erase what happened. It didn't excuse it, but it said something else, that there are ways to return what was broken, not by pretending it never shattered, but by choosing to carry its weight correctly this time. And if the world noticed that Edna's walk became just a little straighter, that her steps slowed less in the mornings, that her fingers gripped with more confidence and less caution, they never said it aloud. They just watched and remembered what it meant when the cane returned. Not because someone asked to be forgiven, but because someone remembered what had been taken and chose, finally, to give it back right. She didn't tell anyone she was going. There was no press advisory, no community meeting, no dignitary waiting at the corner with folded hands and camera-ready sorrow. The street looked like it always did, concrete dulled by time, curbs worn soft by decades of footsteps and exhaust, the bus bench slightly rusted but still standing, as if the years had bent toward it and not the other way around. Edna returned alone, walking with the same steady pace she had always had, unhurried, unafraid, guided not by sight but by familiarity, by a rhythm carved deep into her bones after years of navigating a world that rarely gave her the benefit of attention. She paused at the edge of the crosswalk, right where it happened, not because she needed to remember, it had never left her, but because returning was the only way to ensure that the memory no longer held the same shape. The cane in her hand stood straight, quiet, firm. It did not hesitate. Neither did she. She faced forward and waited. That was all. But the world around her shifted. Not loudly, not theatrically, just shifted. A bus slowed before it reached the stop, though she hadn't flagged it. A delivery driver cut his engine and leaned forward, watching her like a man watching history write itself without ink. On the far sidewalk, a mother walking with her young son slowed her steps, leaned down and whispered, "Look carefully, baby. That's the woman who taught a whole country how to see, without needing to look." Her voice didn't carry far, but Edna heard it anyway. Some things travel louder than volume. Beneath her feet, the faint crack in the pavement where her cane had once split remained unfilled, not because the city had neglected it, but because someone had chosen not to erase it. Next to the crossing button, a small bronze plaque had been installed, barely noticeable unless you knew where to touch. It read, "A white cane once broke here, but we are not allowed to break again." The engraving wasn't polished, wasn't even centered, but it didn't need to be. It had been placed not for tourists or textbooks, but for those who would stop long enough to understand that survival is not the same as resolution, and silence is not the same as peace. No music played, no officials spoke, but when Edna took her first step into the street, the entire block, as if on cue, fell into silence. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Doors remained halfway open. Even the pigeons seemed to hold still. No one told them to do it. No announcement had been made. But somehow they all knew. They watched her cross, alone, upright, untouched, and in that minute no one saw a victim. They saw a presence, unapologetic, undiminished, a presence that did not ask to be praised or pitied or placed in a museum, a presence that simply demanded, "Remember." When she reached the other side, she didn't look back. She didn't raise a hand or nod or smile. She just kept walking as if nothing had happened, because that was the point. To reclaim the ordinary, to restore the unremarkable moment that had once been stolen by cruelty and turned into a national reckoning. She didn't want banners. She didn't want days named after her. She didn't want anyone to make her a symbol if they weren't willing to carry the weight of that symbol in how they treated the next person they met. She didn't teach the country to look back. She taught it to walk forward differently. With caution, yes. With care, yes. But most of all, with the awareness that not seeing is no excuse for not knowing, that dignity does not depend on visibility, that justice does not require volume. In the days that followed, there were articles, think pieces, honors proposed. Some said she should be in textbooks. Some said she should be on stamps. A few called for a statue, but none of that reached her, because she had already done what none of those tributes could. She had walked through a moment that tried to define her, and redefined it instead. She asked for nothing, not revenge, not a reward, not even recognition. She took what was broken and stood anyway, and the world, for once, stood still long enough to understand why that mattered. No headlines could capture it. No speeches could replicate it, because what happened in that moment was not historical. It was human, raw, quiet, irreversible. And when a reporter later asked a resident what they saw when Edna crossed that street again, the resident simply replied, "We saw the country grow up." But Edna never said a word. She just went home, put the cane by the door, and poured herself a glass of water. That night, the street remained quiet for hours, not in fear, but in respect. Because sometimes justice doesn't look like victory. It looks like the absence of interruption, the freedom to move without question, and the grace to expect that freedom without having to earn it over and over again. No ceremony was held. No official declared the day to be significant, but in classrooms and churches, in living rooms and quiet conversations between parents and children, people spoke of her. Not as a saint, not as a hero, but as a reminder that blindness is not what makes people vulnerable. Disregard is. That the loudest lesson a nation can learn often comes from someone who never raised their voice, and the quietest strength is the kind that teaches you to see. She never asked for anything, and in the end, she received exactly what she needed. Not applause, not absolution, just a silence that meant no one dared to disrespect her again. A silence that finally knew how to see. The woman didn't ask to be treated differently. She simply proved that what happened to her should never happen to anyone else again.